Welcome to the Forge Truth Podcast, where we're building great men as God defines greatness. Forge is a movement of men with a mission to help all men realize they are the deeply beloved, redeemed sons of the Most High God. I'm your producer, Zach, and I'm here to discuss the issues that affect men the most with our two hosts, Dr. Pete Alwinson, lifelong pastor and leader of Forge, and Jayson Quiñones, Bishop of Core Faith Church in Oviedo, Florida. Men, welcome to the show.
Hey, here we go.
Yes, we are back at it.
Back at it.
Yeah.
Ready to go.
Yeah, we are in the thick of it today because we are talking about suffering.
Yes.
And that should be an interesting discussion. Jayson, you just preached at Forge about suffering.
Yeah. It's always, suffering is such an exciting topic, right? That's exactly what we want to talk about at 7 o'clock in the morning, suffering. But the truth is that suffering is a reality, as I said, right? I gave a news flash that suffering is inevitable in this world, right? And that doesn't change for Christians. That doesn't change for the followers of Christ. We're in this Colossians series, pointing out that Christ is the true Colossus, that he is big, large, and in charge. And that includes suffering. And so Dr. Pete asked me to speak on men who learn to suffer. And so I think that because suffering is part of what we go through in this world, and we as Christian men have to learn to suffer well and walk through suffering. There's different types of suffering, as we'll talk about here. But my three main points, sort of the big idea that I kind of had was when suffering for the right purpose, we can find joy, hope, and power. Mm-hmm. And I think from the text in Colossians 1:24-29, which is the text we dealt with today, I think we see in the Apostle Paul's response to his suffering that he did find joy even in his suffering. He definitely found hope in his suffering, which kept him going, which I think is a theme throughout the New Testament, that as Christians suffer, as Christians go through hardship and difficulty, as we live this life, one of the passages that we looked at was where we, looking at our outer body is failing us. Yeah. And yet we look forward with hope. And in suffering, there's power. God is at work in our suffering. And that was my prayer and my hope for the guys more than anything else, I think, is that they would really experience the power of God in the midst of their suffering, and that God would use them to continue to expand and extend his kingdom. So that was what we talked about.
Yeah. So what is the proper way of suffering? What is the biblical way of suffering? What's a good reason to suffer?
Yeah.
What was Paul's major point there?
Well, he was obviously in prison, right?
Yeah.
So he's in prison, as you've pointed out, to our guys, this is one of the prison epistles. And so he's incarcerated, which is always fascinating to me, right? Because I do have some experience with family members who are incarcerated. And rarely do you really hear them rejoicing because they're incarcerated, right?
Right.
And obviously their reason for incarceration is different. But listening to the Apostle Paul, it's always peculiar to me how much joy he has even in this. And if we believe the scriptures to be true, he isn't just speaking in hyperbole. He isn't just trying to make you feel good about his suffering. Like, he is genuinely experiencing something in this prison, in this time that he's there. He says, now I rejoice. And so he is really finding joy. Now, does that mean that he was enjoying prison? I don't think he was enjoying prison.
Probably not.
Right? I'm assuming, I don't know, but
he's in stocks with chains, probably bent over, probably been beaten a little bit.
Right.
How many times was Paul beaten with a stick?
Yeah, I don't remember the number.
I think it was 3 times.
Yeah, 3 times.
He was stoned a couple times.
He was stoned a couple times.
Yeah.
I think it was 3 times, and he was, the 40 save one.
Yeah, save one.
Jewish lash.
Yeah.
So they went after him.
Yeah.
He suffered a bunch.
Yeah.
So proper suffering is suffering for Jesus. Why else do men suffer?
Yeah.
I got one of our Forge listeners today texted me right afterwards, and he said, he's going through knee issues. So physically, like you said, the body breaks down.
Right.
One dude walked out there and said, "Hey, see you later, old man." And I was really offended by that. But I am older compared to a lot of people. And we got a lot of young guys at Forge. And so physical suffering that comes from age, that's a real deal.
Yeah.
What do you say to people who are suffering because of physical reasons? How do we put that in here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you look at Second Corinthians, which was the text I was referring to, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 to 18, the Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing," right? "Yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not, for the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." And so I think as we're going through life and we're experiencing our flesh decaying and breaking down on us, I think that's part of it, right? And you always say, you do your best, right? You stay, get healthy, stay healthy, and continue whatever you're saying is. It's amazing. I'm still trying to live it out, but there it is.
Get in shape, stay in shape.
There you go.
Die anyway.
Yes,
eat right, exercise, die anyway. But
I always think about what Satan said to God in Job. And he's basically, Job lost his kids and his livelihood and everything like that. And then he still didn't curse God. And then he said, "Oh yeah, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he'll curse you."
Yeah.
And I'm that way if I get a runny nose. That's where I experience true suffering. But there is something about like you get a physical ailment, and it can be something big, like you're dealing with major issues like cancer and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then for us weak individuals, it can just be like you have an a ingrown toenail or something, and you're just really suffering.
No, I've never seen you complain like that, so I appreciate your humility. You're not like that, but it is true that we men can complain a lot. Like that story of that woman who's in for counseling, and the counselor says, "Do you wake up grumpy every day?" And she says, "No, I let him sleep in." And we men can justify being grumpy. Our wives hate that. Our kids hate it when we're grumpy and negative all the time. Yeah. So I would say, guys, we got to understand that part of our leadership is not being grumpy no matter what's going on. Yeah. So how can we deal with the physical suffering and stay positive? How do you do that? Yeah. What mental, spiritual gymnastics do we need to go through?
Well, so physical suffering, same with emotional suffering, right? But physical suffering is a constant irritation, right?
Yeah,
it's something that's constantly draining you. And so I would say, from lack of experience, that the best way to handle that is as energy is being drained from you, you need something pouring back into you. So the more you are suffering, the more you need to connect to living water and be restored by your prayer life, by your connection with God. Otherwise, you're just going to get sapped.
Right. So if you go through physical or emotional suffering, we men need to I like that, tapping more into the living water.
Yeah, it's kind of like
more than even we normally do.
I would think so. Like when I think of fasting, right? Fasting is intentional suffering, right? In order to connect better to God. Isn't that maybe the point of fasting is like you intentionally undergo suffering in the slightest of ways in order to better connect with God.
Yeah. That's good. And we're going to see that. We're going to see the physical suffering. We also talked about how you talked about, Bishop, how guys suffer for being idiots. And we do. We suffer for doing stupid things.
Yeah, I think there's suffering, right? Like the Apostle Paul suffering purely and solely because of his devotion to the gospel. And then there's the suffering that we're going to have in this life where there's things just as you age, and then there's the stuff that's going to happen that are shocking. I know people that have been healthy all their life, and then they find out things like, wow, how did I even have that ailment or whatever, and so that happens, and then there's the bonehead suffering, that we just decide that we're going to do things, where Peter, Peter talks about us not suffering for doing wrong, right? He talks about us, not anyone. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a busybody in other people's matters. So just boneheaded things, right, that we do. Like,
right.
There's suffering for Christ, and then there's suffering that we deserve, that we earn because we just do things to feed our flesh. We do things that we know are going to be wrong.
So how can we what can we say to Christian men when we make bad decisions, we do stupid things, and we suffer?
Right.
What is a godly man, a great man?
Yeah.
Respond to when he makes a mistake like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're gospel centered, right? Grace based,
right?
And we say all the time, right, that the gospel, the cross, the power of what God has done in us, for Christ, frees us from the control of sin, frees us from the condemnation of sin, and even frees us from the consequence. And I make it clear, consequence, because that's the eternal consequence. But there are still consequences that we experience because of our sin. If we, I was talking to someone, and he was sharing a story about his uncle, and he was saying, my uncle woke up one night with a knife in his back, and his wife had stabbed him in the back.
Whoa.
Well, we were at the gym in the sauna, and there was another guy that was in there, an older guy. He was, at least 20 years older than both of us, and he was listening, and he said, "Yeah, that guy deserved that." He didn't know the story. but then it came out that this gentleman who woke up with a knife in his back, well, he had 4 other kids from 3 other women than his wife. And so did he deserve to be stabbed? Absolutely not, right? But he suffered.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm just saying we don't condone violence, right? But he earned that. He earned that.
I expected it that point.
Right. Yeah. Right. So ultimately, right, in this situation, and she was Hispanic, so definitely hot blood. But the point is
just the one knife.
Just the one knife.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, just one.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, one did it. Apparently, they're still married. In their 60s and late 50s, and they're happy.
So he survived.
He survived.
Yeah.
He had the consequence of the knife, and then he's in Puerto Rico when this happens, and they didn't do a really good job. So for like 6 months, he was in a sling because of ligaments torn, whatever. What's my point? My point is that there were consequences that were there, that were lingering. He had to get through them. And what I would say to men, listen, we all fall short of the glory of God.
No kidding.
And we're all going to make bad decisions, and we're going to suffer the consequences of those. But in the suffering, number one, I think we need to know that there is grace available.
Yeah.
And
even when we do bonehead decisions.
Right, yeah. Even if the consequences, are extreme, to where, you lost your family because of things you did. Your wife said, "I'm done. I'm not going to continue on in this." She didn't stab you in the back and stay with you, So if that happens, that sucks, and it's painful, and you're going to have to suffer through that. And every time that you go pick up your kids or whatever, that's part of your suffering. That's part of your cross.
Sometimes these consequences last for the rest of your adult life.
Right.
One thing I've noticed, and have you guys noticed this, that when a guy commits adultery, and his wife divorces him or wants to divorce him, he'll often say, I apologize, and she hasn't forgiven me. And a lot of times guys expect their wives, when they do bonehead things, to forgive them like right away, like at least within 24 hours. Yeah. I gave her a couple of days. Come on.
Right.
No, it depends on the level of our transgression.
Right.
What another person is able to forgive.
Yeah. And I think you can't expect, and that, again, that's part of your suffering, right? That's part of your pain because you hurt somebody else. You can't expect them to be on a timeline, hey,
that's right. That's right.
Forgive me. Well, she forgave, but her heart is still wounded, right?
That's right.
And so I think, if I'm going to stick with these 3 points of finding joy in suffering, of finding hope in suffering, of finding power in suffering, I think even when we make those boneheaded decisions, I think we rejoice in the fact that we do have the grace of God, that we are forgiven by the Lord. I think that we find hope that God is going to work all things together for good for them that love the Lord and are the called according to his purpose. And I think that we seek to plug into the power of God. God, how can you use me even in this broken situation that is completely, my fault. I completely made the decision that led me here. And I would say that also, guys, don't try to blame someone else. Own the fact.
Do guys do that?
Never.
All the time.
Right. But I would say, don't blame someone else. Don't blame someone else. Just own it. But try to find, God, how can the kingdom of God be extended even through this?
See, does grace help us? Does the grace of God in Christ, does it help us to be more honest with ourselves and accepting our own failure?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so.
Yeah. It should.
Mm-hmm.
I think we say, I am the deeply beloved, redeemed Son of the Most High God, and I messed up.
Yeah.
And He forgives me. I've asked for forgiveness, but there are consequences.
Right.
Yeah, you've got to pay the stupid tax.
Yeah, I love that. And that's true.
Yeah.
So really, Jason's message of suffering, joy in suffering, hope in suffering, power in suffering, that affects even when we do stupid things.
Yeah. Now, obviously, suffering, is hard and, a great evil in some ways, but suffering is a blessing a lot of times, right? My favorite book of the Bible is Philippians. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite books favorite verses in the entire Bible is Philippians 3:10. And it's, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his suffering.
Yep.
And suffering with the right attitude is fellowship with Christ. Mm-hmm. It is another way that we can get closer to Christ, is he suffered. And by us going through suffering in a God-minded way, we can have fellowship with Jesus. And that is a powerful thing.
Yeah. One of the guys at the table asked, he's like, is there like a suffering in the flesh? And he said, so this is what I mean. Like when I first came to Christ, he said, all of my friends that I used to hang out with and do things with, I had to like stop participating with them. And I was like, yes. And that Philippians 3:10 was the verse that I went back to. It's like, man, you're crucifying your flesh, denying that's painful.
Yep.
Suffering for the gospel. And again, I think a lot of times we're thinking, okay, well, we're not in a non-Christian nation that is anti-Christian and where I'm going to die for my faith, so I can't really suffer for my faith here in these United States. And it may be more difficult, but there are plenty of people that are suffering in their flesh. And I think, and you guys tell me what you think, but I don't think that we really get to know Christ as intimately as we can without that fellowship in suffering with him.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. And even, it's so complex, but it brings us to our knees. Suffering brings us to the end of ourself, which is what we need. I'll never forget one time, my wife, I was hiring a staff member, and my wife had just not good sense about it. And I said, well, give me concrete reasons why she couldn't. It was that intuitive thing. And she could, I just don't think it's the right thing to do. I don't think it's the right thing to do. And I went ahead and I paid the price. And it's like, there are those, but it brought me to accept my wife at a deeper level and what God was doing through her. And to the end of myself, life is not as always just as rational as you think it is. And it brought me closer to Christ.
Right.
And that's where we need to be.
Yeah. I'm going to, so you've heard of the 2 greatest commandments, right? Jesus, when he was asked, like, how do you summarize the law? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself is the 2nd greatest commandment. I'm going to declare right now, I think the 3rd greatest commandment, if you add one more to the list, is deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. I think if you were to make a candidate for the 3rd greatest commandment, and it's really, we need to pick up our cross and share in Christ's sufferings along with him.
Death to self. And that's really what discipleship is. And really, that's the foundation of Francis Fenelon's whole point, is that Christ brings us to the end of ourselves. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer as well.
Hey, as an aside, you passed over that real quick, but I don't think of a lot of our listeners have heard of Fenelon. Can you just tell them who he is?
He was the Bishop of Cambrai in France in the 1700s or late 1600s, but great guy. And he really understood the gospel, and he really understood the value. He wrote a little book. There's a little book out called Let Go. You can find it online, but it's Francis Fenelon de Saulnac. He had like 5 last names, something like that. But it's so good, and I've read it a million times, and I keep reading it. It's one of my ongoing books. And he Exodus 3:7 says, "The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering." We have a God who is aware of our suffering, however it's caused. And because of the gospel, he can work in and through it. He wants to, but we've just got to admit it instead of saying, "How you doing? I'm fine." Let him in. But thank you for, Francis Fenelon. Death to self is the way to greatness in the gospel. I believe.
Now, like anything, you can corrupt that, right, with sin. So, like, people can be death to self in a negative way,
right?
Everything can be corrupted.
Right. God has compassion on us, and I love how many times it says that Jesus has compassion on the people. In Matthew 4 times, in Mark 3 times, in Luke 1 time, it talks about the reality that Jesus saw the people and had compassion. Yeah. And I think it's that Greek word, splagna something. Yeah. I can't remember the whole word, but it's that idea of that depth of compassion. And I think as men, as we follow Christ, he wants us to have depth of compassion for other people when they're suffering. Yeah. And when a man shows compassion to other people, it's a powerful thing. Compassion to his wife, his kids, his brothers, as they suffer.
Yeah. Well, and I think as I hear you say that, I think that, men, especially guys that might be going through things, when you're suffering, you feel the loneliest.
You do?
Yes.
Because you feel like you are alone. And like you're the only one that's going through this, like nobody else, because it feels that way. Because it's easy to talk about pain from like somebody else is going through it, or talk about it, or read somebody. But when you're actually in it, man, it feels like you're on an island.
Pain is isolating, isn't it? Yeah,
and it makes you feel, because you feel like, as I'm thinking about this, right? I'm thinking about Adam and Eve in the garden, and there was this complete union and intimacy with the Father. And then there comes this moment where they eat of the fruit, and now they experience fear, and they experience isolation. They experience a separation from God that they never had. Mm-hmm. And so in this world, at least, and I speak for myself, when I'm going through something, I don't know why, but the automatic thing inside of me is like, God, where are you? Even if I don't express it, right? Even if I don't say it, I'm like, man, did you forget about me? Especially when it's ongoing, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, man, I think that guys need to know that's how you feel. And then that's when the enemy wants to come, which I think is the whole Job, part of the Job story. Like, oh, sure, if I can get you to be afflicted physically, then you're going to forget about God and you're going to curse him, right? Because he left you. He's not protecting you anymore. And I think that I believe that guys need to hear that. Like,
so what let's go to the Job thing. So what do Job's friends, what do they lay on him when he's suffering? It's your fault. Yeah. Really, all of them.
Yeah.
There's a lack of faith. You did some sin.
Yeah. There's no way you're really righteous. You're hiding stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so Job really doesn't. The book of Job really doesn't answer the problem of pain. It really doesn't. Ultimately, It doesn't deal with that. But his friends give him false. His friends are a negative example of how you help a guy, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is the ultimate message of Job then? When it comes to his suffering, when we get to the latter chapters?
You guys will correct me, but my takeaway is that don't assume we know what's really going on.
Okay, so I would say that's one big takeaway from the book of Job is you and I really don't know what's going on behind the scenes because there is another reality. And Job didn't know, but he got ticked off too. God, where are you? Yeah. And to his friends, he was saying, show me where I sinned.
Right.
So I think one big takeaway is our suffering. We don't know. There's a cosmic realm. God ordained Job's suffering. Right. Straight out.
Right.
He said, you could touch him, you can kill his family, but you can't kill him.
Right. Yeah, he limited. He limited, and I think that's something else that we have to realize is that God limits what we can go through as well.
That's right.
You know, He doesn't. It's probably never as bad as it could be. You know.
Yeah, and to your point about hope and suffering, one of the greatest helps in suffering is trust. If you trust that like God knows you're suffering and has a plan, he's working something out, that makes it a lot easier than thinking it's mindless or.
Totally. Now, when you suffer, do you feel like God has left you? Like do you say, where's God? I have
to be honest, I've lived a charmed life. I don't feel like I have had to suffer like so many people other have. So for me to talk about suffering seems like a joke because I really haven't undergone a lot of suffering. But when I am suffering, intellectually, I know God has me. Maybe I lose sight of that, and that's where my brothers can remind me. But intellectually, God has me. I know that.
See, and I think that's where we need to get. And maybe it's for my insecurity, and I have lived a charmed life too. I haven't had a lot of ongoing stuff, but I sort of don't feel like I deserve God to heap abundance on me. So whatever I have, and He has heaped abundance on me. So I feel like, God, I don't deserve this. So when things go bad, I go, well, I probably deserve it. But I know He loves me, and I know He's got me, and you know that too, Bishop. You know that He's sovereign. He's large and in charge. And but most of us do experience at some point, if you're going through suffering, you feel the isolation and you say, God, where are you? I mean, I do think that a lot of guys, that's where they go. And we can say, 1 Corinthians 10:13, no temptation or issue has taken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So keep looking for the answer, because your Father will never let you go.
Well, He's there. I think that's the biggest thing that we have to remember is that He's there, and you may not think He's answering your prayer because the suffering doesn't end,
right?
Or you continue to endure it. You continue with the same pain, you continue with the same thorn. I mean, you go through it. I mean, you feel it. But I just think guys need to be encouraged, man. He hasn't forgotten you, and He's there with you.
That's right.
And I think going back to the Philippians 3:10, in the fellowship of suffering, that's where I'm going to know Him the most. And I it's not always. I remember hearing somebody say this, and I thought that it was really good. We often say when we're going through a hardship or a difficulty, what is it that God is trying to teach me? Which I think is good, but this person said, it's not about what God is trying to teach you as much as it is what God is trying to get from you. And God wants your heart more than to teach you a lesson. He wants your heart. He wants your whole heart, your whole devotion. And sometimes we hold on so dearly to this life and the things in this world that God never gets our heart. And so I think that that's something that we got to realize, that He wants our heart. And sometimes the only way to our heart is through the suffering and through the circumstance, because then He gets you to where you come, as you always say, to the end of yourself, where Lord, here I am, so.
Jason, I'd like to subscribe to your newsletter. If you could give me that
It's
info.
called Suffering.
Okay. There is good news here, because in this world we will have trouble, but take heart, for Jesus has overcome the world.
That's
so
right.
There's hope there.
Yep.
Guys, we want to thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we'd love it if you would engage with it, comment, share, subscribe. And if you want to email us, you can email us at forge@forgetruth.com, and we could talk more about this. But Jason, why don't you leave a challenge for our men today?
So I said this, and I encourage you to go back and listen to the message, but I will repeat this here. When our only hope is in what we gain, achieve, or experience in this life, suffering can be unbearable because it is an end. Yet we are constantly reminded that Christ is our hope now and for eternity. Place your hope in him. He will not let you down. God bless you guys.